Alright, this is Susan's 2020 te150i. What we've previously done is we lowered it with a Zeta 30mm lowering kit, front and rear. That's about 1.25 inches. And Susan is going to go over why we lowered it, what she likes, what she doesn't like, and her experiences.
Yep. So I've been riding on the street for a long time, ride on the track, and thought this would be a great way to get into dirt. And so I was stubborn and rode it stock. It was terrible. I couldn't reach on either side. I was on a tiptoe on one side and couldn't reach the peg on the other. It was pretty bad. But I kind of figured it out, tried riding, and I fell a lot. It was zero fun.
You okay?
Constantly finding that if I had to stop, I was falling, picking up the bike, getting really tired, really frustrated. It was just not a good way to learn. So Andy lowered the bike, and it was like magic. I still can't reach on both sides, but I can at least reach the peg. Huge, huge difference. So I felt more confident coming to stops, going through slower sections, even going through goofy terrain or anywhere that was pitched where I thought, okay, crap, I'm gonna need to put a foot down and dab, and I could. So feel a lot better, way more confident riding the bike. Even though it still sits tall, it's lowered just enough to make me feel better about riding it.
So confidence is exactly what we're looking for. So a lot of people, when they start riding or they get their wives into riding, they tend to go with a smaller bike. If you look at like a TTR 230 or a CRF 230 or a 150, it has a much lower seat height. It's got electric start, so it seems fairly, like, oh, that's a friendly bike. That should be easy. That should be fun. But they're very heavy. The suspension is just not really good. It's very outdated. The brakes are very outdated. It's a very cumbersome bike, and it's not going to be able to keep up in the woods with the way that we ride. It's hard to jump on a bike like this, which is a full-size bike. This is the same size as a 252-stroke or a 254-stroke or even a 454-stroke. Same size, same geometry, same clearance. So it's very capable, but when it comes to a person like Susan, who's only about 64 inches, so which is about 5'3", and is about a 28.5-inch seam, it's a challenge for her because she doesn't have the technical skills and the balance and the ability and the clutch skills of a more advanced rider who's been riding for a while. She's still learning. So she comes to a section, she wants to put her feet down, it's a little off camber, and she can't even touch the ground. So boom, she falls over. I mean, she usually ends up putting it in gear, starting it in first, and then taking off before we did the lowering kit, just because she couldn't even touch to shift it into gear. So basically with a 30mm front and rear lowering kit, things are a lot easier for her. She's got a much lighter bike because this is sub 200 pounds. She's got a very capable bike with a lot of good modern technology on it, but it's lower, and we didn't compromise by doing it cheaply, which was doing a lowering link. We did everything internally, and we didn't have to send it out. The big thing I want to show people is if you want to send your stuff out and you're not confident, by all means, send it out to a professional shop. That's a great idea. But there's a lot of really simple things you can do with just a few tools, and you can do it really easily at home. And we're going to show you that next. Okay, now that we've explained why we need to lower the suspension, I'll explain a couple of different ways to lower it, which is really only two, internal, external. We did internal. External would be in the front. You would slide the forks up into the triple trees, which would essentially lower the front end of the tire. The tire would sit up higher in the bike. And in the rear, you could change this link. Some people call it a dog bone. Some people, when they sell them, call it a lowering link. But you change this link right here. I don't really like changing the link in the back, and the reason is when you change the length of this link, you do get a lower suspension or a taller suspension, but you change the geometry back here. This is basically a triangle. When you start changing the geometry of a triangle, you change the way it actuates, you change the way it works, you change the way it feels. So I'm not super crazy about that. We changed it internally. Essentially, this bike has 300 millimeters of travel front and rear, and we inserted a little ring inside here, which essentially stops the piston inside there from going to full extension. So instead of being able to extend out all the way at 300 millimeters, it can only go up to 270. So there's just basically a little bump in there that stops it. In the front, what we've done is we took out, this is the stock spring perch, right? The spring goes in, sits inside the fork like this, and it sits on there. That's what basically gives you your height. What we've done is we've taken it out and put in a zeta lowering one, which is 30 millimeters lower. So the spring sits here originally, and now it sits down here. And that basically just drops the whole front end. Same idea. We're not changing any of the internal mechanics, any of the way that the oil flows. We're not changing anything geometrically in the front or the rear. We're literally just changing how far it can extend. What we're also changing, and what we already did change, is most bikes, including this one, are set for about 165 to 185 pound rider. Now Susan's only 120 pounds. So that means that when she's riding the bike, if I leave the stock springs in, you want to be sitting right in the middle of your stroke when you sit down on the bike. So when you go over a bump, when you go up, when you go down, the suspension has room to go up, has room to go down, okay? Now, if she's only 120 pounds and the suspension's set for a 175 pound rider, she's barely compressing the suspension when he sits on it. So she's basically sitting at the top of its stroke. So she has room to go down, but it's very stiff because she doesn't weigh enough to compress it, and she feels really top heavy. The bike's gonna sit taller, which A, isn't good for her because she's shorter and we're already trying to lower it. And it's just gonna feel really top heavy, really bobbly, really unstable. We wanna lower the spring rate, make it softer so I can get her to sit in the proper stroke of her suspension. So it's gonna handle more like the bike was designed to handle with a 165 to 185 pound rider. So now that we've kind of shown you that, next we'll take it all apart. I hate the seat is actually insanely hard to get off. There we go. There we go. It's literally that easy to get the shock out. And when you put it back in, just be careful that you line this rubber boot up with the new intake, and make sure to put this back on and tighten it tight so you don't get crap in your intake. All right, so first, before we do anything, I want to clean this thing off. It's not terribly dirty, but there's some crap on it. We don't want to get any of that inside the shock, so we're just gonna use a little bit of WD-40 and just get the grime off the outside shell of it. Nothing super crazy. And then the next step before we do anything after that is bleeding the air out of it. Now, these shocks are full of nitrogen gas, which goes in right here. So we're gonna slowly crack that and bleed the air out of it. That way we can push this piston up to install that little zeta. Basically, it's like a bump stop. It's basically like a travel limiter, but without the nitrogen there, we won't be able to compress that to install that part. So we got to get that out. Hear that? Get that nitrogen out. Nice and slow. There we go. No need to rush. We're not in a hurry. I'm going to grab this same Allen, right? This is the locking collar that locks this from rotating. So when you rotate this nut, that adds preload or subtracts preload from your spring. That's how you set your sag, right? So I'm going to loosen this. That's loose. All that's doing is keeping this from spinning. Now what I need to do is I need to go in here and and I need to just loosen this nut. And it takes a little while. It's kind of a pain in the butt. I'm doing this on this rag because there's a lot of dirt coming off. This is going to be my dirty rag, and this is my clean work surface over here. Because I'm sure this is pretty clean because Susan's bike's still pretty new. Whatever you're working on is probably not going to be this pretty. So now that this is loose, the spring's loose inside here. This collar right here, this collar just slides down like that, and then there's a clip right here. See this little clip? That's all that holds your spring on. That's it. This little itty bitty clip right here, that's what holds your life. And you're literally just gonna pop that off. This slides out like that. Then this slides over like this. And then your spring slides right off. Look at that. It's pretty simple. Again, we're gonna clean all this. I'm gonna lay this out. I wanna clean all these components because I don't wanna put this back together with dirt all over it. That would be bad. Okay, next step, pretty simple. Everything's disassembled, everything's cleaned. I gotta take this ring off and slide this down. It's just like kind of like a protector collar. What a lot of people do is they take a screwdriver and they shove it in here and they pry it down. And that kind of mars up the aluminum. I'm not stoked about that. I like things to stay clean. So what I did find is a 15/64 drill bit is like the exact diameter of that. Look at how nice and tight that fits. That's beautiful. So I'm gonna put one in this end, right? I'm gonna take one and put it in, if I can see what I'm doing while looking at the camera, one in each end. One here, one here. I'm gonna stand it up like so. I'm actually gonna do it here and here because I'm in the way of the shock body right here. I'm gonna take a little rubber mallet, and if you watch real close, we're just gonna gently walk this out. See that cup popping out? That's it. That's all we wanted. Right? Then we have to push this piston down and take this lock ring out. And what happens is when we do that, we install this little zeta piece inside here, like so. Put the new lock ring there, and that just limits the piston from being able to come and extend out that much, which is whatever the thickness of this is. It ends up being 30 millimeters of travel, which is basically like roughly 1.25 inches, a little less, 1.1 inches. And then I just pop this back in here, pop this back on here, and we're done. Put everything back together. Tap this back on, and you just reverse the process. It's very, very, very simple. That doesn't need to be perfect. You just want to make sure it's not sitting on here. You do want to make sure you don't scratch this shaft at all, because if you scratch this shaft, you'll get an oil leak in there for sure. And then we literally just take the perch, we put this thick perch back on top. So this goes on here like this. There we go. And then the spring goes back on. This is a 3.4 spring. I think I took out a 3.8 or a 3.9 with stock. They're just different thicknesses, different coils. If you look at them next to each other real close, you can see that the thickness of each one is just a little bit different. And the coils are about the same spacing, but they're just a different thickness. This is a much lighter gauge diameter coil, and this is a much thicker coil. So that's her old one, which was a 3.8, I think, and that's a 3.4 I got from Slavens. They actually didn't even stock it because it's not that common, but they were able to get it to me within like 3 or 4 days. So basically this just goes on here. Doesn't matter if it goes this way, doesn't matter if it goes this way, whatever you want to do. Take this, pop this back on here, pop this back on here. Take this collar, put it back here, and the last thing that goes on is this. Now this is super critical, right? this clip has to sit inside this groove. This is what holds all of the weight of your suspension. This magic clip. It's actually pretty amazing. And you gotta make sure that that is seated nice and tight in that little groove. And then this just pops up in here like this. And the suspension sits up and like that. The spring sits right on this little seat. Flip it back over, tighten this down, and I'll put it back to my 10-inch spec. That's about what it was. This wasn't on there very tight. She's a light human. I can tighten this up here, or I can tighten this up on the bike. I prefer to actually tighten this up on the bike, so that way if I ever have to take it apart, I can actually access it. This rotates, right? Now that that's done, I just go to the dealer. I have them refill this with nitrogen, and that's done. Okay, now that the rear shock has the Zeta lowering link in it, I can go ahead and pop it back here and put it back together. Most important thing, shock bolts, blue Loctite on the 2 major shock bolts. Don't want those coming off. I'm not going to tell you guys any torque specs or anything, but you should be torquing everything to spec. So, I left this ring loose because A, I like to tighten it in the bike so I can set what this is, and B, when I'm all done with this, I want to check the sag for Susan anyways. So, take this bad boy and get this back inside here. And before I tighten up the top, I want to drop the subframe down because it tends to get in the way of putting the shock back on. So we're going to pull the subframe down like this. And we're going to try and line the boot back up for the intake. Pop the intake back on. I usually like to put a little bit of grease on there to help it pop back in, but I already had grease on there from before because I took this apart recently, so not a problem. Before I do anything, tighten up this boot for the intake. Definitely want to be sure that that intake boot is tight, or else you'll end up with a leak, bike won't start, you won't have fun. That's not fun. Next, I can lower my bike back down until my shock lines up with this hole again. And that lined up real nice. And we're again going to torque that spec. I'm going to go check the torque spec. So for this particular bike, it should be 44 foot-pounds. I don't like to play games with shocks because we don't want that coming off. Like I said, this is probably the same for most bikes that are KTM and or Husqvarna, but I don't want to tell you that. And then you trust me, and it's wrong. So you check your manual. There we go. Now, we're going to put the subframe bolts back in. Same thing. I want Loctite on the subframe bolts. Another thing I really don't want coming off. Since I rotated the subframe, I'm going to make sure those are snug, which they are. I can put all my side panels back on. And we can go ahead and do the front. Okay, we're ready to do the front end. I'm only going to do one side. I'm only going to do one fork, which will be the left fork, which is the harder one because it's got the brake caliper on it. Because I already did this, so I'm not going to do both sides. That's a lot of work. So first and most important is that speed sensor. I'm going to cut the cable tie that holds it on. And then we want to take a nice little pick which is real handy to get that electrical connector off. Make sure we separate that. And we want to take off the brake rotor with our 10 mil. I said rotor, I meant caliper. Screws up here, again, 10 mils. And if you look on the top of these triples, this is the one place that you will find a torque spec on all bikes. I believe it's 15 up here, and I can't see it, but it should be 17 up here. Most of them are 15 and 17. You do want to make sure you use a torque wrench on those, because you need to kind of go back and forth and torque those again, and click them a couple of times, because you want that to clamp square. If that doesn't clamp square, you overload one bolt and not the other, and you clamp kind of crooked. It'll clamp more here and less here. You want it to clamp perfectly square all the way around, or else that won't bite good, and you can get that to slide up inside there. You could damage this, you could crack. You could actually crack your triple, so make sure you torque those. That's super important. While I'm here, I'm also going to put these little canyon dancers on. These are great. My buddy Danny got these for me one time for my bike, and it makes it so much easier to tie the bikes down. All right, now my fork tube should just slide right out. Again, I want to clean it. These little lines on here are really good markers for how high you want your forks and your triples, and where you put that changes the way the bike handles. It changes where the front end sits. So another reason I don't like to lower bikes by just sliding this up, right? I could easily take this and I could lower her front end by just mashing this as high up as it'll go, right? But then I can't get to any of these adjustments to adjust the suspension. Step one on the forks. Take my rebound adjuster all the way down and count my clicks. So I'm going to turn it all the way off. So 1, 2, 3, 31, 32, 33. Okay, once the rebound's shut off, I can go ahead and take this cap off. There we go. Undo this cap completely. There we go. Then I'm going to try and dump all my oil. I want to try and save all this oil, because why not? It's still pretty new. It's still a pretty new bike. So I want to see if I can save as much of it as long as it's still clean. There's not that many hours on this bike. There's no reason to dump it if it's not bad. That's good for now. Pop that this way. Put my oil canister over here. I'm going to take this and put this right here where the axle goes through in the vise. I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to put that right there where the axle goes through the rag so I don't damage it. Rest that right there. All right, now that my cap is loose, I can slide this back, and now what I need to do is grab my 15/16 wrench, which is probably something metric, but this is working for now, and slide my spring back, and I need to put my wrench right here, like that. So my wrench is basically on that right there, and then this is where this comes in. This is where my special wrench comes in. Now I can't take this off this way, right? Because I can damage this. I need to basically line this up right here, and I need to use this side of the wrench. So you can buy these wrenches slotted like this, but I was impatient. I didn't have one, so I took this wrench that I already had, slotted it, and now I can just take this, and I should just be able to pop this right off without damaging anything, just like that. I've been told if you try and rotate out here, instead of rotating on these two flats, which is what sets your preload, you can damage this preload cap. I read it, I've been told it. It's what all the cool kids say, so I'm gonna trust it. All right, now that that's off, I'll take my cap off. Get some of this crap out of my way. I can slide the spring out with a bunch more oil. And I can take my damper rod out. And once I pull my damper rod out, inspect it, make sure it's not galled or damaged. Put that to the side. Okay, now what I need to do is I need to take this out and see if I can get any more oil dumped out of it before I move on to the next step. Oh yeah, I got a bunch more. Let's try and pump it. See if I can get any more out of the rod. A little, not a bunch. Okay, stick this back in the vise. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this screw out in the back. This is what holds the whole damper rod system in the bike. So I have a wrench for that. Good thing I had a 3-foot breaker bar, because that did not want to come out. Okay, we'll take that, put it aside. Okay, now that this piece is out, we can slide. Ooh, a little bit of oil coming out there, that's okay. This rod should pop right out. Hey, I know where all that extra oil came from. It's all puking out the back. Let's try and dump this, because it is not happy. Oh, there we go. That was a lot of extra oil. I think most of it's already on my floor. That's okay. This rod should pop right out though. There we go. That's what I was looking for. And there's that. So there's that rod. There's that Zeta piece we're talking about. Okay, so the old one looked like this. So this used to sit here. So the spring used to sit basically right here, and now the spring sits down here. So that's where we get our 30 millimeters. We also get our 30 millimeters from internally in here. There's, I think it's a bump stop, and there's a piece when I pull this rod apart, you'll see there's another piece inside here that we have to install from the bottom. So now I need to separate, because this won't come off here. Whoops. I need to get all this oil out of here first is what I need to do. But now I need to separate basically this piece from this rod, because this won't come off. This is stuck. So to get this off, this is to come off. This is where we have to get creative, because I was supposed to be able to use this. I ordered one of these. Unfortunately, it's too large. It's not the right size. So what I've been using is I've been cheating, and I use this little strap wrench, and I slide it around here, and I pinch it just ever so gently, because if I damage this, I ruin this rod. So I don't want to damage it. So we'll do that next. Okay, now I need to get basically this piece off of this shaft. Normally this doesn't come off so easily. Sometimes it threads on, sometimes it threads off, sometimes it's a bitch. So what I have done in the past is I take a really thick strap wrench, I got it from Harbor Freight, and I basically pinch it like this, and then I take my pliers and I just pinch it ever so gently. I need to get enough pressure on it so this doesn't spin and it overcomes the pressure of this thing wanting to rotate. And you just pinch it. Don't pinch it hard, because again, if you collapse this, you ruin it. So I pinch it there, I take this off, and I slide this out. boom, that's it. Pretty simple. Slide this piece off. And what would be my old ring, which would have been this one, I'd have been taking off, and I'm installing these now. Now on my other one, for some reason I was missing this piece, so I took this one apart to double check that I still had this in there. The other one was missing it for some reason. All right, this comes out, this rod, and part of the Zeta kit is a dampening piece. I believe this is the bump stop right here, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a spacer because this is getting shorter, right? That means this needs to stop earlier as well. So there's a spacer that you slide up inside here, and you basically have to press in without damaging the walls. So I did that already, obviously last time. I can't take it out and put it back in, but it is basically like up inside here. So then you would just, after you'd install that spacer, you would slide this rod back in, right? You would take what would be your new Zeta lowering kit and get it out of this oil. And you would slide this over. It's this first little shim. And then you would slide your Zeta piece over. You need to make sure that this piece of plastic is there. That's what keeps the spring from damaging this, because this is aluminum, right? So it can damage the aluminum and throw chunks of metal in your oil. And now I just take this and slide this back over. Pretty simple. And thread this on again till it completely bottoms out. I want to go as far as I can go. So it takes a while. There's a lot of threads. And this should just stop. There we go. Just like that. That's it. Now we're ready to just grab the fork tubes. I'm going to grab this again. Put it back in the vise. Let it rest on something so it doesn't fall. This is squared off here, right? And this fits into a pocket in the back of the fork. And then that cap that I took off on the bottom threads into there. So that keeps it from rotating. So we're going to take this. I need to pull this cap back out. So I put it in there so it wouldn't leak. My wrench is here. Come on, little cat. You can do it. There we go. And then my rod's in here. I don't know how you can see this, but that has to slide inside there like that. Just kind of got to pop your finger in there, wiggle it around till that lines up, and then you take your cap, put your cap back in there, and that cap is what holds in the fork tube in the right location. Torque this bad boy down. All right, now that everything's reassembled, I'm going to go and take my damper rod and slide my damper rod back in. I'm going to take my oil. I'm going to dump my oil back in. And the manual said 20.75-ish, plus or minus a little bit. So I'm a little short, obviously, because I lost some. So I'm going to end up adding a little bit more. About another ounce. Not a ton. So there's what I took out. We're going to add a little bit extra. Some manufacturers spec out a volume tolerance. Some manufacturers spec out a height from the top, which I have a height gauge for, which I showed you earlier. I couldn't find a height gauge in this manual, so we're just going to stick with how much it says it needs. So the next step is we got to bleed it. So we got to get all the air out of the system, and it's going to take a little while. You can kind of feel it when there's air in it. It gets a little jumpy, and it makes some noise. Once the air is out of it, it starts getting really smooth, and it stops making bubbly noises. So you got to do that a bunch of times, get all the air out of it. There we go. That should be good. Okay, now the fun part. Sometimes this is a little tricky trying to get the spring on. So what I usually do is I kind of cock it sideways a little bit. I get the spring in there. Drop it on. The cartridge likes to fall, that's the hard part. And then I'll kind of stick my finger under there and I'll rotate the spring. That's how I always do it. The spring walks down, then I take the cap, make sure it's clean, thread the cap on. Okay, then I take my wrench that I use to take it off, push the spring down, put my wrench on. It might need to come up a little bit more before I can get my wrench on it. And I'm just gonna take my wrench, put my wrench on here. Same thing, I don't wanna tighten with the cap side, I wanna tighten with this side. So we're gonna do the same thing again. I'm just gonna pop that on there like that. I don't know how well you can see that. And then we're just gonna tighten until that's fully seated. That's good, and that's it. It's literally all it is. Slide this back up. And I can tighten this either in a vise or I can tighten it on the bike. And then I just gotta slide this back in the triples, line up whichever line that I matched on the other side with this one, which was the first line from the top. So that way the forks are even. And we're done, that's it. Super, super simple. It's not hard at all. Takes a few simple tools. You gotta buy a couple of them, but they're cheap. All right, well, that's pretty much it. Big thanks to the guys over at Wolf Enduro for giving me a call and asking me to do this little tutorial video, which I am not a pro at. I'm not a pro at suspension. I'm not a pro at working on bikes. I just like doing research. I like teaching people. I like trying. So if you want to do it yourself, go ahead and give it a try. If you're not comfortable with it, go to a dealer, go to a suspension shop, call a pro. I am not a pro. If you want to check me out doing not pro things, hit me up at Overkill Andy on Instagram or Illinois Dual Sport Riders. We're generally out riding bikes. Thanks for watching.